Asterisk. Welcome back, dear listeners. Tonight, we return to the edge of the Atlantic, where a house waits on the cliffs. Hollow Point has stood for generations, remembering every debt, keeping every secret, never forgiven. Within its walls are voices, ledgers, and the sound of the sea that is not. The sea, so dim your lights. Silence the world outside, and follow me into the house that remembers. But beware, some debts can never be paid, and some doors should never be opened. Asterisk the house at Hollow Point. The train screeched as it pulled into the coastal town of Great. Jonah Ashcroft had not stepped foot here in 17 years, not since the night he swore never to return. Yet here he was, clutching a single suitcase and staring out the grimy window at a place that smelled of salt, rust, and secrets. Grefford had always been a forgotten town, crouched against the Atlantic like a guilty dog. Its streets crooked, its buildings weary. But what Jonah saw now was worse than memory. The houses sagged deeper, the docks leaned more, and the shadows pooled thicker at every corner. It was as if the town itself had been waiting for him, rotting in anticipation. He should have gone anywhere else, but the letter had left him no choice. It had arrived 3 weeks ago, unsigned, with only a single sentence in handwriting he recognized too well. The house remembers what you left behind. The house, so Hollow Point. Jonah's chest tightened. That house had ended his childhood, ended his family, ended his life as he knew it. He built a career as a historian in another city, trying to bury what had happened on the cliffs above the Atlantic. But some things don't stay buried. Not when the tide itself seems determined to dig them back up. The platform was empty. He stepped off the train into the biting wind. The suitcase felt heavier than its contents, perhaps because it wasn't just clothes. It carried fear, expectation, and the faint hope of answers. Grayford looked worse up close. Windows boarded, storefronts empty, boats half sunk. At the people who remained moved quickly, as if afraid to linger in open air. Jonah caught a few stares, whispers that traveled faster than footsteps. He knew what they were thinking. Ashcroft, the boy from Hollow Point. He's back. He took the narrow road that twisted uphill toward the cliffs. His boots crunched on gravel, echoing in a silence that was never just silence. For beyond it came the constant drone of the sea, the Atlantic smashing itself against the rocks, grinding its own bones into sand. That sound had been the lullaby of his childhood and the dirge of his family's end. By the time Jonah reached the crest, dusk had begun to bruise the horizon, and there it was. Hollow Point. The house crouched like a predator at the cliff's edge, 3 stories of weather-blackened wood and windows that reflected nothing. Its roof sagged, its paint peeled, but it still radiated presence, a kind of awareness that made Jonah's skin crawl. He had seen ruins across Europe in his academic work castles, monasteries, temples swallowed by centuries, yet none of them looked as alive in their decay as this house did. The wind rose. The front gate, rusted and half-broken, creaked open as if inviting him in. He hesitated, Every rational part of him screamed to turn back, to board the next train out. But he knew he couldn't. The letter had dragged him here, but something older held him. No unfinished business, unanswered questions. He stepped through. Inside, Hollow Point smelled of damp wood, mildew, and something faintly metallic. Dust drifted like lazy snowflakes, yet beneath the dust, the furniture was exactly as he remembered. The grandfather clock by the staircase, frozen at 11:46. The velvet armchair sagging by the hearth. The oil painting of the Ashcroft ancestors glaring from the wall. It was as though the house had been waiting, untouched, for his return. Jonah, the voice was a whisper, soft as breath but sharp as glass. He spun, heart pounding. The hallway was empty, shadows pooled at the edges, stretching long in the dying light. He swallowed hard. Just the house, he muttered. Old wood, old memories. But he knew it wasn't. He climbed the stairs. Each step groaned under his weight, protesting his intrusion. On the landing, he paused before the door to his old bedroom. The knob was cold, too cold. He pushed it open. Inside, the room looked as though a child still lived there. The bed neatly made, the desk cluttered with notebooks, the shelves lined with seashells he had once collected. His throat tightened. Someone had preserved this space, frozen it in time. But who? On the desk lay a new object. A small tape recorder, modern, out of place. A red light blinked. Jonah's hand trembled as he pressed play. A voice filled the room, his father's voice. If you're hearing this, the house has opened again. It will not stop. You must finish what we could not. The house remembers. Static swallowed the rest. Jonah staggered back, his legs weak. His father had died in this house. He had seen the body himself. So how? Jonah. The door slammed behind him. The window rattled, though no wind blew, and from the walls came a sound, faint at first, then growing, the sound of the sea, but wrong. Not waves, not water, something beneath, something deeper. Jonah's heart hammered. He realized then that the letter had not summoned him. The house had. And it was not finished. The second message was waiting for him at the top of the stairs when he left his old room. A narrow strip of salt poured across the landing, like a boundary line. It ran from baseboard to baseboard, bright against the grimy boards, so straight it must have been laid with a ruler. Jonah crouched. The salt grains gleamed like tiny bones. The house breathed around him, the soft settling of timber, the sigh of a window finding its frame. A draft licked the back of his neck, though every door was shut. He reached out one finger toward the salt, hesitated, then brushed it aside. The house answered with a sound like a laugh held in the walls. The hallway light dimmed. Somewhere below, the grandfather clock coughed itself one step closer to life. The pendulum swung once, twice, then stopped at the same frozen time 11:46. You always were impatient, said a voice behind him. A woman's voice, this time, dry as the pages of a book left open too long. He spun. At the far end of the landing stood Mrs. Gull, who had cleaned for the Ashcrofts since before Jonah was born. She was slighter than he remembered, smaller than a memory should be allowed to become, wrapped in a gray cardigan that matched the light, hair braided like rope. Her eyes, however, were the same, tied dark, unsentimental, and far too familiar with grief. "Mrs. Gall," he said, trying to make his voice behave. How are you here? This house has a habit of keeping things," she said. "It kept me too." "How did you laid the salt?" She eyed the thin smear he'd made with his finger. "I did. Shouldn't have touched it." "Why?" "Because it wasn't for you," she said. "It was for what follows you." Jonah's skin tightened. The absurdity of its outlines in a decaying manner should have made him smile. It didn't. He found himself glancing back down the stairs, as if he might see footprints in nothing. "Your father left messages," Mrs. Gall continued, nodding toward the bedroom where the tape recorder lay. "Not just one, several. He knew the house had opened again, long before he died. He tried to keep it closed. Salt was one of his ways. Words were another. He died here," Jonah said, the words tasting like old pennies. Mrs. Gall's expression thinned but didn't break. "He did. He also refused to leave. Said the house couldn't be abandoned to itself. Said it learned too fast when it was alone." Jonah remembered his father's hands, big, careful hands stained with varnish from restoring furniture, hands that trembled a little when the wind rose. He could picture those hands laying salt lines with the precision of a carpenter, building boundaries the way other men built tables. "I thought the tapes were gone," Jonah said. No. They returned what they didn't understand, Mrs. Gall said. "Or what returned itself?" She tilted her head as if listening to a name called from very far away. "You should hear the next one." He followed her back into his old room. The air had settled. Dust resuspended into its quiet orbit. The tape recorder waited on the desk, red light and unblinking pupil. The sea sound in the walls had softened to a murmur, like a conversation being deliberately held at the next table. Mrs. Gall pressed stop, then eject. Inside the cassette bay lay not one but 3 cassettes. The one Jonah had played a second, labeled "Basement" in his father's hand, and a third scrawled with hollow point "Does not forgive" in black marker that had bled through the paper label. Her fingers hovered over "Basement." "He said to play them in order," she murmured, voice thinner. "But he never said whose order." She slid "Basement" in and pressed play. Static. Then his father's voice, riding above the hiss like a boat on a tide. "If you're hearing Basement, You've ignored the first sign or the house ignored you. Salt line. Top landing. Do not cross it unless you intend to be seen. The house is hungriest at the bottom. It remembers from the ground up. The recorder popped. The sound thinned, then returned, as if the tape itself didn't want certain words said aloud. There is a room beneath the cellar that does not exist on the plans. Your grandfather called it the coal room. It has not held coal for a century. Sometimes it holds other things. If the walls begin to breathe, leave. If you hear the sea without wind, leave. If you smell copper, leave. If you see your mother, leave silence, sudden and absolute, like a door slammed in a storm. Your mother, Mrs. Gull whispered, the hush of the word more dangerous than a shout. He never put her on tape. Jonah hadn't realized his hands had closed into fists until his nails bit. He always said she drowned, he said. The night hollow point took her. That was what we told everyone. That was what the town told us. And what did the house tell you? Asked Mrs. Gull. A sound rose under the floorboards in answer. Something like a yawn. Jonah couldn't tell if it came from deep in the house or deep in him. Show me the cellar, he said. Mrs. Gull looked at the tape, then at him. You always were. Your father's son, she said. Stubborn in the same places. She pocketed the other cassette, the one with the bleeding letters as if it needed to be kept close to skin to stay where it belonged. They descended with the careful slowness of people moving through a memory that might bite. The stairwell to the ground floor had narrowed since Jonah was a boy, or perhaps his shoulders had broadened and the house had not forgiven him for it. The steps stirred old smells. Wet wood, long dead fire, the sweet rot of fabric that had known better rooms. The kitchen was exactly as he remembered cast iron range. A table scrubbed to the grain, a bowl on the counter that once held apples and now held dust. Beyond the kitchen, a door sat flush to the wall. It had been painted the color of nothing, so it could learn to be a wall and not an invitation. The knob was iron, and colder than the air. Your father kept it locked, said Mrs. Gull. He also kept the key where the house would notice, because he believed in honesty even with things that cannot be honest. Where? She opened a drawer and moved aside folded dishcloths until she found a little tinna, cough drop tin with faded cherries on the lid. Inside lay the key. Heavy, archaic, notched in a way that looked almost like letters from a language that forgot itself. Jonah took it. It warmed quickly in his grip. He wasn't sure if that was reassuring. The lock turned with a reluctance that felt more like opinion than rust. The door opened onto a staircase of raw stone steps angling down into dimness. Someone, his father, had strung a naked bulb at the top. It lit a cone of air that stopped halfway down like it had changed its mind. The house is hungriest at the bottom, his father had said. Jonah remembered the taste of the basement from childhood. Damp iron, an undernote like old nettles. He remembered the hiss of his mother's dress as she hurried him past the door. He remembered his father's low voice saying, "Not tonight." He remembered, most vividly, a night he wasn't supposed to remember rain on the roof like nails. His parents arguing in a way that had thunder baked in, and his mother saying, You told me it was done. You told me it took what it was owed. And his father gentle, impossible father saying, Hollow Point does not forgive. Stay here, Jonah said to Mrs. Gall. She snorted, a sound much larger than her frame, and leave you alone with it. If it wants you, it will have you, whether I stand in this kitchen or the coal room itself. But buy one tea lets you go down there without someone old enough to be in debt. That every house has a ledger, she said. This one keeps meticulous accounts. She took a length of twine from the hook by the pantry and tied one end around the banister and the other around her wrist. Then she handed the coil to Jonah. He looped it around his wrist, too. If the light goes, we count the twine, she said. When it's counting, count louder. What is it, Mrs. Gall? The part of Hollow Point that remembers, she said simply, and started down. They counted the steps softly, because loud seemed an affront and silence seemed a lie. 12 to the bend, 7 to the floor. The bulb above threw enough light to make shadows that invented themselves on the walls. The ceiling pressed low. The basement was as Jonah remembered, shelves with jars furred with dust, a workbench with tools arranged as if the hand that placed them had expected to return in 5 minutes. The sea sound threaded through everything. Not the real ocean, which gnawed at the cliff beyond the house with patient teeth. This sound had too regular a pulse. It moved like someone thinking. At the far end of the basement, tucked behind the old coal chute, was a square of wall darker than dark. It wasn't a door, there was no frame, no hinge, no handle, but the mortar around the bricks had been scraped once and replastered in a paler shade, and someone had scribed a tiny cross of salt at the center of the lowest row. The coal room, said Mrs. Gall, or what your grandfather called it when we still lined our lives with names. How does it open? Depends who you are, she said. When your father went in, he spoke a word I never learned. When your mother went in, the wall opened itself. She went in. She did, said Mrs. Gall evenly, and then the door held for a very long time. Jonah's breath shivered against his teeth. What did she go in for? To ask it to forget, said Mrs. Gall. To ask it to forgive. And did it? Houses keep accounts, she repeated. Forgiveness is a different currency. Jonah approached the false wall. Up close, the bricks looked wet. Although the air was dry, he could see tiny striations in the mortar where someone, long ago, had pressed their fingertips. He could smell salt, and beneath it, copper. He bent, touched the little cross of salt lightly. It adhered to his finger. The mortar trembled. Don't, said Mrs. Gall. But he had already done it. The wall sighed and became a door. It didn't swing. It relented. The bricks lost their stiffness and the mortar blurred. And then there was a space where there hadn't been one, narrow and tall, with breath-cold air curling out. Beyond, a room lay that had no right to belong to any house. It was taller than the basement and narrower, with walls that met at angles that didn't sum neatly to 90. The ceiling climbed away. The floor sloped toward a low trough in the center filled with something that was in tea water but behaved like it. The air shimmered slightly, as if the room were a throat and someone were speaking through it. Salt had been poured in geometries on the floor, a triangle nested inside a circle, an arrow pointing toward a wall that looked less like masonry and more like shoreline. Jonah felt an urge to laugh that had nothing to do with humor. His father's careful lines. His father's careful life. On the far wall hung a Miravel, ornate, framed in wood that had been carved with waves and eyes. The glass was black as a raven's wing until you looked its way. Then it inhabited your gaze and returned it emptied of something you could only name by losing. Jonah did not mean to speak his mother's name. He didn't think he remembered how to say it in this house. But his mouth moved and there it was, complete and fragile in the cold room air. Evelyn. The mirror rippled. He stepped forward. "Count," said Mrs. Gull sharply. "Count whatever you can. Names. Fingers. The breaths you've taken since you came down the stairs. Do not let it count you more than you count yourself." He reached for numbers like a drowning man reaches for rope. 1 for the first step they'd taken, 2 for the second, up to 19 for the basement floor, 20 for the threshold, 21 for what? For the first time his mother had kissed his forehead and called him by a secret name. 22 for the way his father had taught him to plane wood with the grain, never against it. 23 for the night it rained nails. 24 for the mirror now. Its surface deepening from black to a gray that had texture like breathing. 25 for. The mirror showed him 2 figures at first, indistinct. A man tall and stooped in a way that love stoops you. A woman with hair braided back the way Mrs. Gull wore hers. But when they turned, only the woman had a face, and it was hers. Not as she had been the day she last sang, in the kitchen flour on her cheek and a half-laugh on her tongue, but as she had been in Jonah's worst dream. Wet, unblinking mouth full of seawater and something that made seawater look kind. "Jonah," she said, and the horrible relief of hearing his name in that voice made him want to lie down on the salt and let the room draw around him like a blanket. He took a step. Mrs. Gull's twine pulled, neat and firm, against his wrist. He felt the kitchen in that pull. The drawer with the cough drop tin, the table scrubbed to the grain. He braced his feet. The mirror did not appreciate refusal. It clouded like breath. "Don't," said Mrs. Gull, voice low. "It's not her. It's what the house kept." "Why would it keep her?" Jonah asked, his voice a thread. "Because we asked it to keep what we loved, and we were not careful with the asking," said Mrs. Gull. "Because once the house taught us that memory could be stored, we wanted to store too much. Because Hollow Point does not forgive. And we are made of things that require forgiving." The mirrored Evelyn smiled, and it was almost real this time. The way a photograph of a flame is almost warm. "Your father played tapes to put the house to sleep," she murmured. He laid salt to tell it what not to eat, but he asked it for one thing anyway, to keep the sound of you running down the hall, your laugh at the top of the stairs, your voice calling his name. It kept me instead, because the house remembers wrong on purpose. It always takes the most valuable object when you give it a list. Stop talking to it, said Mrs. Gall. It can speak any sentence you need to hear to open your mouth wider. Jonah tore his eyes away. The room swam and steadied. The trough in the center filled and emptied with no source but its decision. He heard the ocean again. But the wrong one, the interior ocean that sloshes in the head when blood is loud. What does it want? He asked. The house. It wants a ledger with no red ink, said Mrs. Gall. It wants us to be even. It can't forgive. It can only balance. How do we balance something that took my mother? Jonah's voice cracked. How do we pay a debt we didn't know we made? Mrs. Gall's mouth soft at the edges. Your father tried to pay with himself, she said. He went into this room more times than any man should. He brought back sounds and left behind years. When the ledger wouldn't clear, he looked for a better currency. He made those tapes. The tapes are what? Receipts? Jonah asked bitterly. Keys, she said. And wedges. Words to hold a door open or shut. Just long enough. He believed in proof. He believed if he could show the house itself what it was doing, it would learn different. Can it? Houses learn the way, cliffs learn the shape of waves, said Mrs. Gall. Slowly and only by breaking. In the mirror, Evelyn's mouth moved as if she were counting. 1, 2, 3. The Chahuff answered with its own rhythm, and the walls breathed in a new meter. The air tasted increasingly of copper. Time, said Mrs. Gall. We've been here long enough for it to notice the difference between hope and hunger. What do we take with us? Jonah asked, desperate suddenly for a task. A handle. Mrs. Gall nodded toward a low shelf carved into the wall. On it lay objects like offerings. A child's marble, an iron nail carefully straightened, a lock of pale hair tied with blue thread, a paper boat yellowed to parchment, a small wooden fish Jonah recognized immediately, because he had carved it with his father. The summer he turned 9, he lifted the fish. The grain remembered his hands. When did he began? Your father returned it, said Mrs. Gall. It took it again the next day. That's what I mean by ledgers. You can borrow back, but the interest is cut from bone. Jonah set the fish down with a care that made his forearms ache. He looked at the mirror. His mother had stopped counting. She was looking at his hands. Take the tape, said Mrs. Gall, practical as a rope. We'll need it to lay the next line. Then we go upstairs and play the last message. And then we decide what to give the house that it cannot use. What does that even mean? You'll know when you have nothing else, she said. That's the trouble with the right currency. They backed out of the coal room together. Steps matching not by plan, but by the old habit of people who had once eaten from the same pot. The door did not close behind them so much as resume responsibility for being a wall. The basement's air felt thick after the room's thinness. The bulb above them flickered twice, then steadied. In the kitchen, the clock in the hall above them coughed again, and tried to remember how to move. Jonah closed the basement door and turned the new old key. The iron warmed in the lock as if grateful to have work. At the top of the stairs, Mrs. Gall reminded him, "We lay the salt again. The house knows you. It will be curious." He poured a clean line, careful not to break the grains with his breathing. He did not step across it. They went back to his room. The tape recorder waited as before. Too patient? Mrs. Gold took the third cassette, the one with the bled letters, out of her pocket. For a second, she pressed it to her sternum like someone warming a baby's hand. Then she slid it in. The tape hissed. It always began that way, as if the house itself were taking a breath. "If you're at Hala Point does not forgive," said his father, voice roughened by nights of not sleeping and by conversations with masonry, "then I have failed to keep you from the bottom. Jonah, if it is you, forgive me the way the house will not. Forgive me because I loved too well and not carefully enough. Houses are like gods. They hear what worshippers mean to say and take what is meant without asking." He coughed, a ragged piece of sound that made Jonah's throat hurt in sympathy. "I tried to find another arithmetic. I tried to trade the house stories for silence. It swallowed the stories and learned to speak. I tried to trade it my time. It ate that too. I tried to trade it my body, but it doesn't want what earth can already claim. It wants what salt preserves. It wants what sound returns." The tape cracked. The sound warped, pitched down, then righted itself. "So this is the last arithmetic I have. We give it something it cannot listen to. We give it what has no echo. We give it a promise we keep outside its walls." Mrs. Gull made a small sound. Neither agreement nor refusal. Just a human noise to prove a human was there. "Jonah," the voice continued, softer, as if he had leaned closer to the microphone, "you were always making paper boats and sending them down the gutter to see if they would find the sea. This house is the end of all gutters. It finds every sea. If you ever return, bring with you one thing it cannot drown. An ending you believe in. Speak it aloud where your mother went. Tell it we're finished and then be finished." The tape wound on without words for 10 seconds that felt like a mile of road. Then the click of the stop button pressed from the same hand that had laid salt lines and built tables and failed at forgiving himself. The recorder popped itself silent. Jonah stared at his own reflection in the black plastic. A man who looked too much like his father. Eyes rimmed in salt sleep, jaw set around a grief that hadn't been named properly for 17 years. "What does it mean," he said, "to give a house an ending?" "It means you decide what cannot be negotiated," said Mrs. Gall. "And then you live like it's true. I don't know how. You will when the other choice is worse." He went to the window. Outside, the Atlantic was shouldering the cliff like an argument it intended to win. The town of Grayford crouched with its back to the water, pretending smallness might save it. "Somewhere?" A gull cried a sentence composed only of knives. Jonah looked at the bed where a boy had once pretended to sleep and listened for bad weather. He looked at the shelf of shells, which had never been empty, because the house made it so when he ran out of new ones to find. He looked at the door, not the door to the hall, but the other, the door in him that had opened when the mirror rippled. He looked at Mrs. Gall. "If it learns by breaking," he said, "what do we break?" "Everything it expects," she said. "We don't give it a song. We don't give it a sacrifice. We don't beg. We don't bargain. We go to the coal room and we tell it the name of the last thing it will get from us, and then we do not give it that either." He laughed once, a sound with too many edges. "And what happens when it takes? Anyway, then we remember louder than it does," said Mrs. Gall. "And if we can't, we find someone who can." "Who?" She looked toward the town, toward the church, whose bell hadn't rung since the steeple cracked, toward the harbor where boats sat like punctuation marks that hadn't found their sentences. "There are others who owe hollow point," she said. Grayford remembers in its own way. "Debts like this ripple." A shape passed along the hall, no weight, just a rearrangement of light. The salt line held. The shape paused, testing, then it withdrew. More interested than thwarted, Jonah felt the house move a fraction closer under his feet, as if the timbers had taken a breath. "Tonight?" he said, the word heavy and certain. A coin slammed on a counter. "We go down and we end the ledger." Mrs. Gall's mouth twitched into what might be called a smile by someone generous. "Bring your father's voice with you," she said, tapping the recorder. "And bring your mother's name. But bring something else too." "What else?" "A story you are willing to let die," she said. "It will be your offering, not to the house, but to yourself." Jonah nodded, though he did not yet understand. He gathered the tapes, slid the recorder into his coat pocket, tucked a bag of salt under his arm. He took the twine and wound it around his wrist again until he could feel his pulse in the cord. The house listened as they moved. The stairs spoke in a timber tongue. The clock, offended by decision, refused to tick. Salt rattled in its bag, a dry surf. At the basement door, he paused and looked at the key in his hand. It was no more special than metal made sacred by use. He slid it into the lock. The iron sighed when the door swung open and the cold rose as if the earth had exhaled. Jonah understood one small part of what his father had meant. Endings are not what doors do. Doors are suggestions. Endings are what you say when you stop making strangers with your own life. He looked at Mrs. Gall. She nodded, as if counting with him. They began to count their steps down into the hungry part of the house. The house at Hollow Point. The twine bit into Jonah's wrist as he descended the last steps into the coal room. Each knot Mrs. Gall had tied was a heartbeat, a reminder that there was still skin and pulse and choice left in him. The air grew heavier the deeper they went. It wasn't dampness or lack of oxygen, it was intention. The house was aware. Every stair was like walking down someone's throat. At the threshold, the wall softened once again into a door. The coal room breathed them in. The trough in the center still shivered with its impossible knot water, still rippled with the rhythm of counting. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4, 5. Mrs. Gull's eyes flicked toward the mirror on the far wall. Its surface was awake already, rippling like skin touched by wind. It knows you came back. It knows it can collect more. Jonah stepped across the salt lines his father had drawn years ago. They had faded, scattered, broken. The house had licked them away grain by grain. The trough burbled. The sound was almost speech now. A wet, cavernous voice that rose and fell in syllables he nearly understood. Mrs. Gull shoved the recorder into his hand. Play it, reminded of his voice. Jonah pressed play. His father's voice spilled into the room, raspy but strong. Hollow points. You take, you keep, you remember. But I am telling you, this ledger is closed. The coal room shuddered. The trough hissed. The mirror darkened, but the counting did not stop. 7. Jonah's chest tightened. It's not. Listen, because you don't believe it. Mrs. Gull hissed. The house knows when you lie. That was your father's mistake. He gave it words without endings. He left space for bargaining. The mirror rippled. A face emerged. Evelyn, his mother. Her hair was plastered to her skull, as though she had just risen from drowning. Her eyes were as he remembered them the last night, dark, loving, furious. Jonah, she whispered, and even the air bent to carry her voice. It's time. The house has waited long enough. Jonah's knees weakened. He wanted to step forward, to believe, to be the child who once hid in her arms when the sea howled at the windows. But Mrs. Gull gripped the twine and yanked him back. It is not her, she barked. It's her memory, twisted. The house remembers wrong on purpose. The Miravellan frowned. Why are you listening to her? She kept you from me. I have been here all along, waiting. If you come through, we can be together. Jonah's throat ached. Did you choose this? Did you give yourself to it? Yes, the mirror said instantly. Too quickly. And in that instant, Jonah knew his mother would never have said that. She would have cursed the sea itself before surrender. He lifted the recorder again, but this time, he didn't press play. He spoke into it, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his bones. This ends here. You don't get my father. You don't get my mother. You don't get me. Hollow Point's ledger is closed. The trough gurgled violently, splashing brine onto the salt lines. The Miravellan screamed, a sound that shook the walls. The counting accelerated. 8, 9, 10. Mrs. Gull pressed her back to Jonah's, shouting over the roar. It's taking faster. You have to give it something. Jonah's mind raced. What did his father say? Give it what has no echo. He thought of the house, how it fed on memory, on sound, on things that linger. What had no echo, a story with an ending. He pulled the last cassette from his pocket, the one labeled Hollow Point Does Not Forgive. He snapped it in two, the tape unspooled into his hands, spilling nonsense syllables into the air. The coal room howled, furious. This story ends, Jonah shouted, and you don't get to keep it." He flung the broken tape into the trough. The liquid hissed as if burned. The counting staggered, tripping over itself. The mirror shattered. Not with glass, but with silence. The reflection of his mother dissolved into a smear of nothing. The coal room screamed once more, a sound that was every wave, every storm, every memory collapsing at once. Then it went still. The trough emptied, the walls steadied, the air lifted from their chests. Jonah fell to his knees, trembling. "Is it over?" Mrs. Gull loosened the twine from her wrist. Her hands shook, but her voice was steady. "No house ever forgets. But this one won't count again, not in our lifetime." Jonah stared at the broken cassette floating in the trough. His father's voice was gone, consumed. But in that destruction, something had closed. A finality. They sealed the coal room with salt. They locked the basement door. Jonah threw the key into the sea. The next morning, the townsfolk whispered of a silence in the cliffs. The hum that had haunted Grayford for generations was gone. Jonah left Hollow Point that same day. He did not look back, but sometimes, at night, when the wind rises, he swears he can hear counting. 1, 2, 3, and then it stops. For now, asterisk. And so, the house at Hollow Point fell silent. For now, its ledger closed, its voices stilled, its hunger denied. But houses never truly forget, and silence is only the space before the next sound. Thank you for joining me on this haunting journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more full-length horror and mystery tales every week. Until next time, keep listening, but never trust the echo.